The year was 1944. The war in the Pacific had swallowed entire continents, and now it had begun swallowing men. When the transport ship from the Philippines reached the coast of Japan, the prisoners inside were silent, hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging off their bones. Among them were soldiers from a unit few Japanese guards had ever seen before, Black Americans from segregated regiments, captured when the islands fell. As they stepped onto the docks, local workers stopped and stared. For many Japanese civilians, it was their first time seeing a black man in person. The guards barked orders, forcing them into line, but the eyes watching from the crowd were not filled with hate, only curiosity. The men were marched inland to a camp outside Osaka, a place of cold mornings and endless labor. The rules were simple: work, obey, survive. But survival didn't mean living. It meant disappearing. Yet even in that place of hunger and frost, life had strange ways of finding its way in. One of the prisoners, Private Samuel Carter, a mechanic from Georgia, noticed her first, a young Japanese woman who brought water to the fields. Her name was Aiko, and she kept her head down, her eyes avoiding the guards. But sometimes, when she passed, she would glance, just a flicker, and that flicker was enough. Samuel didn't know her language. She didn't know his. But suffering has its own grammar. In the evenings, when the guards' boots faded into distance, she would leave small pieces of bread near the fence. A silent offering. He'd find them, never touching until she was gone, afraid it might bring her trouble. In a world built on division, race, flag, enemy, that single act of kindness was treason. And yet, it was how it began. Days turned into weeks. The cold grew sharper, and the prisoners weaker. The guards' tempers flared easily. A man could be beaten for working too slowly, for looking the wrong way, or for simply existing. Samuel Carter learned to move carefully. He spoke little, kept his eyes low, but his thoughts were alive, clinging to the memory of Aiko's quiet kindness. Each morning, he scanned the work line, hoping to see her again. She appeared one evening just before sunset, her hair tied back, carrying a bucket of rice scraps for the pigs. He watched her pour the feed near the fence, her hands trembling slightly. As she turned to leave, he did something reckless. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden carving he had made from a broken tool handle. A tiny bird, its wings unfinished. He placed it on the ground, just past the wire, and stepped back. Aiko froze. The guards weren't near, but risk had a smell, and it was thick in the air. Still, she bent down, picked up the carving, and slipped it into her sleeve. She didn't speak. She only bowed her head, a gesture of both gratitude and fear, before walking away. That night, Samuel could hardly sleep. He wasn't sure if he had doomed them both or if he had done the only thing that made him human again. The next morning, when the prisoners returned to the field, something waited where the carving had been. A strip of cloth folded neatly, with a single cherry blossom pressed inside. He held it in his hand for a long time, then hid it under his shirt before the guard could see. For the first time since capture, he smiled. To the world outside, they were enemies. To the guards, they were nothing. But to each other, they had quietly become proof that the war could cage bodies, but not compassion. And though neither dared to speak it, both knew. The moment they crossed that invisible line, there would be no going back. The air over Osaka had changed. By early 1945, the distant thunder of American bombers could sometimes be heard rolling in from the coast, a reminder that the empire itself was cracking. Inside the camp, the prisoners worked longer hours, repairing rail lines and hauling supplies. The guards grew more desperate, more cruel. But in the few quiet moments between dusk and curfew, a miracle of defiance continued, two people still finding each other. Aiko began working in the kitchen that served the guards. From there, she could sneak bits of food or small scraps of paper. At first, her notes were only drawings, a bird, a sun, a tree, things that spoke in the same language as Samuel's carving. But soon, she began writing words in Japanese, and below them, phonetic sounds written in English letters. He copied them into the dirt beside his cot at night, whispering them under his breath: friend, water, danger, and sometimes her name. One evening, when the guards drank too much sake and forgot to patrol the outer path, Aiko slipped beyond the kitchen fence. She carried a paper lantern, dimmed low, its glow barely cutting through the mist. Samuel was there, shoveling coal into a trench, the fire reflecting in his eyes. He froze when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. She shook her head. "Quick," she said softly, her accent wrapping around the English word. She handed him a small pouch. Inside were dried sweet potatoes and something even rarer, a pencil stub. Their hands brushed for a moment, skin against skin, the first human warmth he'd felt in months. Neither spoke after that. They didn't need to. When she left, she looked back once, the lantern swinging faintly in her hand. He stood there long after she disappeared, clutching the pencil like a relic. That night, under the single bulb of the barracks, Samuel wrote his first word since capture. Not a letter, not a prayer. Just a promise scratched into a scrap of paper. "When this ends, I'll find you again." But he didn't yet know that in this war, endings came at a price. It happened on a morning heavy with fog. The prisoners were lined up for roll call, shivering in the damp air, when a guard shouted something harsh and short. Everyone froze. A scrap of paper had been found near the outer fence. Samuel's blood went cold before the guard even unfolded it. He didn't need to see what was written. He already knew. It was one of Aiko's notes, one she must have dropped by accident the night before. The commander's face darkened as he read the half-erased words. "Water, friend, bird." He crumpled the paper, barked an order, and a soldier dragged Samuel forward. "What is this?" the interpreter demanded. Samuel kept his eyes down. "I don't know." The first blow came fast, the butt of a rifle against his ribs. "What is this?" the man repeated. Another strike. Another question. In the crowd, the other POWs stood silent, helpless. They had all learned that defending another man was an easy way to die. At last, when the guards grew tired, they threw Samuel back onto the ground. The commander said something low, then pointed toward the kitchen building. Two soldiers marched off, toward Aiko. She was pulled from her post within minutes, still holding a wooden ladle. The soldiers shoved her into the yard, shouting accusations she couldn't deny. The commander lifted the note again, waving it in her face. "You helped the enemy?" She didn't speak. She only bowed her head, as if bracing for what was to come. The blow that followed wasn't just punishment. It was meant to humiliate. One strike, then another, until her knees gave out. The guards laughed. The prisoners watched, powerless. Samuel tried to stand. Two men held him back. "Don't," one whispered. "They'll kill you." Aiko didn't cry. When the guards finally tired and walked away, she lay in the mud, breathing shallowly. Then, slowly, she looked up. Through blood and rain, her eyes found Samuel's across the yard. Neither moved. Neither dared. But that look, that single, wordless moment, carried more strength than any guard's shout. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the rain and to the faint hum of planes far overhead. He knew the world was breaking open beyond the camp, and that if they didn't survive the war, their story would die with them. He swore silently that it wouldn't. By midsummer 1945, the sky itself had turned into an enemy. Every week, the prisoners could hear the thunder of engines, the sound of B-29 bombers flying toward Osaka and Kobe. They brought not just destruction, but a strange kind of hope, proof that the war was collapsing. For the guards, it meant desperation. Food ran short, tempers broke easily, and discipline, once brutal, now frantic, turned into madness. Samuel's ribs still ached from the beating. Aiko had been moved from the kitchen to the infirmary to scrub floors under supervision. They no longer spoke, but sometimes, when he was marched past the building, he'd see her silhouette in the window, thin, bruised, still standing. Then came the night the world changed. Sirens wailed without warning. Searchlights tore through the dark as the sky filled with American planes. The first explosions landed near the city. From the camp hilltop, the prisoners could see Osaka burning, entire districts swallowed by fire. The guards panicked. Some fled to the shelters. Others shouted contradictory orders. In the confusion, a section of the outer fence collapsed under debris. For the first time, the way out stood open. Men whispered frantically, "Now, we can run." But Samuel didn't move. His eyes were on the infirmary. Flames had reached the far wall. The roof was catching. He could hear screams, not of soldiers, but of civilians trapped inside. He ran. Through smoke and falling timber, he found her. Aiko was pinned under a fallen beam, coughing through the soot. He lifted until his arms gave out, until at last the wood shifted just enough to drag her free. Go, she gasped. You must go. He shook his head. Not without you. Outside, the prisoners who'd escaped were disappearing into the forest. The guards had fled. Fire consumed everything else. Together they stumbled through the wreckage, one enemy carrying another. They reached the outer path, where the air was clearer. Behind them, the camp burned like a pyre. For a moment, neither spoke. The war, the pain, the punishment, all of it felt small beside the sound of their own breathing. Aiko turned to him and said the one English word she had learned perfectly. Free. Samuel looked toward the dark horizon and nodded. But freedom in wartime Japan was a dangerous illusion, and the night was far from over. They walked for days. No map, no food, only a direction, north, toward Kyoto, where the fires hadn't yet reached. Samuel wore rags and carried what little water they'd salvaged in a tin can. Aiko's arm was bandaged with torn cloth. They kept off main roads, moving through rice paddies and wooded hills, hiding when patrols passed. The war had left Japan hollow. Villages stood silent, roofs caved in. The smell of smoke followed the wind. Once, they saw a group of children picking through the ruins of a burned train, looking for anything not melted. At night, they slept under shrines or in the shells of farmhouses. Aiko taught him small words: Mizu, water; Ki, tree; Tenshi, angel. He repeated them softly, as if language itself might keep them alive. But the further they went, the more the world closed around them. Posters warned of spies. Soldiers stopped travelers. And word had spread: 2 fugitives, 1 American, 1 Japanese woman. One evening, as the light faded, they reached a small river near the edge of a valley. Samuel collapsed by the bank, too weak to go on. Aiko knelt beside him. You rest, she said. I find food. He tried to protest, but she was already gone. Hours passed. The sky turned purple, then black. When she finally returned, she was trembling. Not from fear, from what she carried. In her hand was a single rice ball, still warm. I trade my hair, she whispered. He didn't understand, until he saw her scalp, roughly cut, patches missing. She had given her hair to a villager in exchange for food. Samuel stared at her in disbelief. Then he broke the rice ball in half and pushed the larger piece toward her. She shook her head. You need. He smiled faintly. We both do. They ate in silence. The sound of the river covered their breathing. For the first time in months, they felt something close to peace. When dawn came, the sky over Kyoto glowed faintly red, not with fire, but sunrise. Aiko looked toward it and whispered, maybe war finished soon. Samuel wanted to believe her. But in his heart, he knew wars never end cleanly. They leave marks deeper than wounds. It was August 15th, 1945. The air felt strangely still, as if the whole country were holding its breath. Samuel and Aiko had made it to the outskirts of Kyoto, hiding in a half-collapsed tea house near a temple. For days, they'd heard rumors that Japan was ready to surrender, but no one dared believe it. Then, that morning, a villager turned on a battered radio. The voice that came through was soft, distant, like a ghost speaking from another world. It was the emperor himself. For the first time in history, his people heard his voice. The villagers fell to their knees. Some wept. Others stared in disbelief. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the silence that followed, the heavy, stunned quiet of a nation realizing the war was over. Aiko translated haltingly. He say we stop fight. Japan surrender. The words hung in the air. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel let out a shaky breath and laughed. Not with joy, but relief that felt almost painful. It's over, he said. But she didn't smile. In the days that followed, the chaos only deepened. Japanese soldiers burned their uniforms. Civilians fled cities. The Americans, Samuel's own countrymen, would soon arrive to occupy Japan. And that meant one thing. If they found him here, a fugitive POW hiding with a Japanese woman, both would be treated as traitors. Aiko understood before he said it. They come, she whispered. You go. He shook his head. I won't leave you. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. You must. Then, almost in a whisper, if they see me with you, they kill me. Samuel stared at her. The woman who had once been his captor now saving him again. This time, from his own people. The next morning, She led him to the edge of a bamboo grove. The path beyond led toward the coast, where Allied troops would land within days. She handed him a folded scrap of paper, one of the notes she'd once slipped through the fence. On it were only 3 words, written carefully in English. "You are free." Samuel reached for her hand, but she pulled back, tears in her eyes. "Go," she said, "before they come." He wanted to tell her everything he couldn't, that he would find her again, that none of this would be forgotten, but the words died in his throat. So he turned and walked into the trees. When he looked back one last time, she was gone. Samuel reached the coast days later, half-starved, sunburned, and hollow-eyed. When the first American landing party found him wandering near a fishing village, they didn't believe he was one of their own. "Name?" a Marine demanded, rifle raised. "Corporal Samuel Price," he croaked. The officer frowned. "You're one of the colored units?" Samuel nodded weakly. They looked at each other, uncertain, as if they'd found a ghost. He was taken to a field hospital, cleaned, fed, and interrogated. Doctors examined the scars on his back and ribs. Officers asked questions about the camp. But when he tried to mention Aiko, the woman who had saved him, their expressions changed. "A Japanese woman?" "Yes," Samuel said quietly. The officer's pen stopped moving. "You mean the enemy." After that, they didn't write down her name again. By September, Samuel was aboard a ship bound for San Francisco. The ocean stretched endlessly, but his mind stayed in the bamboo grove, in the sound of her voice saying, "You are free." When the ship docked, crowds waited to welcome home the victorious soldiers. But not for him. Black troops disembarked separately, ushered into smaller lines. There were no flags, no cameras, no brass bands. Just a quiet move along. He stepped onto American soil, the land of liberty, and felt more like a stranger than ever before. In the months that followed, he tried to rebuild his life. A job at a factory, a rented room in a segregated neighborhood, nights spent staring at the Pacific, wondering if she was alive. Sometimes he'd dream of her, standing in the mist, holding that last note. He'd wake with it still in his hand, creased from being unfolded too many times. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was worse than captivity. One evening, a letter arrived from a former comrade, one of the few other black POWs who had survived. Inside was a newspaper clipping. It showed American soldiers entering Kyoto, smiling beside Japanese civilians. At the edge of the crowd, half hidden, was a woman in a plain kimono, her hair uneven, her eyes downcast. Samuel stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it gently and placed it beside the note. He whispered, "You are free," as if saying it might make it true for both of them. The years slipped away like ash in the wind. By 1952, America had moved on, rebuilding, booming, forgetting. Samuel lived alone in a small apartment above a shoe shop in Detroit. His medals hung in a drawer. No one ever asked about the war anymore, and when they did, he only said, "Japan," and changed the subject. But one night, after hearing the news that U.S. forces were withdrawing from the occupation, he found himself sitting at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He picked up a pen. "Kyoto, Japan. To Aiko, I never knew your last name. If you are alive, I want you to know I made it home. You saved me more than once, not just from death, but from hate. You taught me what mercy looks like when the world forgets it." He paused. The ink blotted. He tried to remember her voice, her smile, the smell of rice fields after rain. "I never thanked you properly. I'm sorry for that. If the war took everything from us, at least it left me one truth. You were braver than anyone I ever met." He signed it simply, Samuel. The next morning, he took the letter to the post office. The clerk glanced at the address and frowned. "Japan," he said. "You sure about that?" Samuel nodded. Weeks turned into months. No reply. Then, one spring morning, an envelope arrived. Thin, foreign, marked with Japanese script. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a single pressed blossom. Cherry petals, pale and fragile. No words. But he didn't need them. He understood. She was alive, or someone who knew her was. And somewhere across the ocean, someone had remembered him, too. Samuel placed the blossom inside a small box, beside the note she'd once written. "You are free." He closed it carefully and whispered, "No, we both are." The year was 1987. A group of university researchers in Kyoto were cataloging wartime artifacts for a new exhibition: letters, photos, fragments of camp uniforms. Among the boxes was a bundle of papers found in a shuttered temple on the city's edge. Inside, there were records from a former internment site, lists of prisoners, handwritten notes from a kitchen worker named Aiko Tanaka. One of them stood out. It was in English, simple, clumsy, but unmistakably heartfelt. To Samuel, "You are free. Please never forget me." No one knew who Samuel was. The records showed no American POW by that name, at least not officially. But the curator kept the letter aside, curious. A few years later, an American Veterans Archive in Washington received a private donation: journals, medals, and a small wooden box. Inside were two things: a folded note written in Japanese and a pressed cherry blossom. On the inside lid, faintly scratched into the wood, were three words: Kyoto, 1945, free. The archivist made the connection by accident, decades after both Aiko and Samuel had passed away. Today, their letters sit side by side in a glass case at the Kyoto War Peace Museum. No explanation, no embellishment, just two notes, each half of a conversation that outlived the war that tried to silence it. Visitors often stop and stare, trying to imagine who they were: a prisoner and a guard, an enemy and a friend. But the truth doesn't fit in any category. It belongs somewhere deeper, in the fragile space between forgiveness and memory. And if you stand long enough before the case, the reflection in the glass makes it look as if the two notes are touching. In the final days of World War II, a captured Black American soldier and a Japanese woman defied hatred, risking their lives for a love that history tried to erase, until their letters were found, decades later, side by side in a Kyoto museum.